coming up on Send Backup with Dr. Paul Conway.
So they were saying, not so bad, I still care about other things. They're maintaining this sense of balance between their work and the rest of their life. But people have worse outcomes when they engage in a lot of self-blame, rumination, catastrophizing, and other blame. It can start with leadership. So you can have senior people talk about times they felt upset or distress and maybe some steps they took when they did, which communicates to everyone that's normal, it happens. A lot of people agree that they want to seem capable. There's pressure to seem strong. Weakness is not allowed in this culture. It seems like everyone else can cope, and they don't trust the confidentiality. We asked 600, 700 people, how much exposure do you have, and how are you feeling? When people reported more exposure to this CSAM material, this child exploitation material, they reported slightly elevated moral injury, but they did not report more.
Welcome to Harmless the Podcast. I'm your host, Eric Oldenburg, and today we're talking to a very unique individual. Today we are talking to a scientist. This scientist is named Dr. Paul Conway. Now, Dr. Paul Conway is from the United Kingdom. However, he is Canadian by heritage, which you will understand when you start to hear him talk here in a little bit. But the more important thing is that Dr. Conway conducted a study recently called Protecting the Protectors, Moral Injury, Coping Styles, and Mental Health of UK Police Officers and Staff Investigating Child Sexual Abuse Material. Now, the authors of this study are Paul Conway, Teresa Redmond, Samantha Lundgren, Simon Bailey, and Peter Lee. And the Department of Psychology with the University of Southampton teamed up with the Policing Institute for the Eastern Region, Anglia Ruskin University, and the University of Portsmouth to conduct this incredible study that Paul is going to unwrap for you. So without further ado, I give you Send Backup with Dr. Paul Conway. Welcome, Paul. Thank you very much for being here on my podcast and lending a scientific hand to the discussions that we're having. I believe it's super important that we bring in experts that know what they're doing, know what they're talking about, and have conducted scientific research that backs up some of the things that I believe are going on. And Paul, you've been referred to me by several different people based on a presentation you gave at Interpol about a recent study that you conducted. That is absolutely fascinating to me, and we're going to get into that. But before we do, I would like you, if you wouldn't mind, to introduce yourself and tell us basically who is Paul Conway, where are you now, and how did you end up doing this study?
Great. Thanks for having me, Eric. Good to be here. Yeah, my name is Dr. Paul Conway. I'm an associate professor of psychology at the University of Southampton. I study psychology and, in particular, moral psychology. I study how people think about others and right and wrong and decide who is good and bad and that kind of thing. And along the way, I got interested in this topic called moral injury, this idea that people can damage the moral self-concept by doing bad things or witnessing bad things that keeps them up at night, and it erodes their sense of self. And that's something that I was starting to study more generally. And I ended up encountering some colleagues like Peter Lee in particular, and then some colleagues at the Policing Institute for the Eastern Region. And they were interested in moral injury in police officers. So they said to me, we have a project that we're putting together. We want to measure moral injury among other things. Do you want to join? And so, yeah, I joined it as the quantitative guy who's going to measure everything and run the numbers on this project. And this data is what resulted.
What drew you to being a researcher when it comes to moral psychology? What drew you to that field?
Yeah, I took a class in undergraduate called The Evolution of Morality, and I thought that's ridiculous. Morality can't evolve. Everyone knows that evolution is about biology, and then morality is about being a good person. So obviously it has to be based on culture or something. And then over the course of this undergraduate class, we read a lot of books and articles and debated things, and it pretty much persuaded me that morality can be thought of as a useful evolutionary strategy a biological strategy for maximizing your individual well-being in an uncertain world where you need friends and allies at your back to defeat the problems of the world, but that renders you vulnerable to exploitation by unscrupulous characters. And I've been fascinated ever since, and I've essentially dedicated my career to understanding when and why do people feel like they do.
That's fascinating. Now, one of the things that I noticed when I was reading kind of your CV, that you did some studies related to, there's two terms that I was unfamiliar with that I had to look up. One was deontological and the other was utilitarian. I thought I knew what utilitarian meant, but in the context of morality, what do those two terms mean?
So those are terms that philosophers give us, and scientists have wisely or unwisely just adopted the terminology from philosophy and then started to look at what philosophers were talking about. So they talk a lot about this idea of sacrifice. Should you sacrifice one person to save 5 lives, for example? And according to the ethics of deontology, the most famous deontologist is Immanuel Kant, then you cannot sacrifice. It's not allowed because you have to always treat all humans like they have dignity. You can never treat an individual as a means, as a tool to improve the well-being for someone else. That's undignified and immoral according to the view. On the other hand, if you take a utilitarian or a consequentialist view, the focus is on the utility or the consequences of actions. So something causing harm, sacrifice, can be moral if the consequences are worth it, quote unquote. So there's these utilitarian philosophers like John Stuart Mill or Peter Singer who argue that we have to evaluate actions by their outcomes as opposed to the nature of the action itself, the way that a deontological ethics person would say. And so a lot of work that I and other scientists are doing are looking at, okay, how do humans resolve moral dilemmas? When do people think it's okay to harm one to save 5, for example? And they have all these different psychological mechanisms contributing to these judgments. And then the judgment itself could be described as a deontological or utilitarian judgment, not because the people making it are philosophers, but they're regular people using regular psychology to arrive at a judgment, and then a philosopher would identify that judgment and say, aha, as a deontologist, I approve of this judgment.
So the example that comes to mind for me, and a lot of people aren't familiar with this, is the trolley car problem. That's the one that I believe hits both of those, depending on what you choose. Can you explain what that is real quick?
So the trolley dilemma, the classic case is that there's a runaway trolley and it's about to run over 5 people. And you're like, oh no, that's bad. So then you could press the button to make it change direction and run over one person instead. So the question is, should you press the button to kill one person with a trolley to save 5 people from the same trolley? And doing so, again, is forbidden from a deontological perspective and required from a utilitarian perspective. But real people have a wide variety of opinions based on a wide variety of concerns and considerations.
And there's a bunch of ways you can iterate that problem as well. That one person is not a stranger, now they're your sibling or your grandmother or something like that, which would slightly change things. Now, from my perspective, I would absolutely throw the switch. And so that would make me utilitarian, not deontological, because I'm going to sacrifice the one person for the betterment of the 5.
Right. So one thing that my work has done is we rarely look at a single decision to a single dilemma because it's not very informative. And instead, we try and suss out a pattern of responding across a series of dilemmas. And doing that, you can tease out, okay, is someone's pattern fairly close to what a deontological philosopher would approve of? Do they consistently reject harm regardless of outcomes? Or are they more in line with what a utilitarian philosopher would approve of? Do they consistently maximize outcomes regardless of whether doing so causes harm or not? Then there's other patterns of responding, like one that a psychopath might approve of, generally harm everyone regardless of outcomes, or even better, maximize the worst outcomes possible.
Would you say you lean towards utilitarian or deontological, or do you know?
When you put it in this sort of pattern, it becomes clear there's different ways to think about it. People can be focused on uniquely deontological or uniquely utilitarian patterns of responding, or some people seem to combine those concerns. And they seem to say, I really don't want to cause harm ever unless it's really truly necessary, and then I will bend unwillingly in rare cases, right? As opposed to someone else leaping at the opportunity to cause harm anytime it might slightly improve things. And so what my data over and over seem to suggest that it's this balance of deontological concerns with utilitarian concerns that signifies moral maturity. It's not just the unique focus on one or the other. Actually, what I think we need is balance, where people try to avoid harm, but are open to the possibility that in some rare cases, it may be necessary.
Have you found that either direction you would go, let's say the trolley car problem, that's going to cause moral injury no matter what you do because someone's going to get harmed along the way? So either way, is there moral injury involved?
It's a great question. I don't actually think anyone's ever investigated moral injury in the context of sacrificial dilemmas. It strikes me that the deontological position in a lot of cases lets you get away without really truly feeling involved. You can just feel like a bystander. You're saying, there goes a trolley, what a shame. Oh dear, good thing I didn't do anything. Versus in the classic cases, at least, the utilitarian position requires stepping up to the plate, exerting some leadership, and saying, I'll be the one to choose who dies here, and I will sacrifice this one to save those people. So chances are that should lead to some sense of moral injury, especially the more realistic it becomes. It would fit with the other data we have, but I don't think it's been looked at specifically.
In a military capacity is something that comes, to mind with me, that, hey, we have to go do this. We have this objective. We're going to have X amount of casualties. And if you're deontological and you're lacking the leadership skills, then you're going to avoid anything, and then the conflict's not going to happen. So it's almost like it sounds to me, the more utilitarian you are, the more you're going to lean into taking responsibility, which would then cause moral injury. Would you agree with that? Does that make sense?
There's some work by Hanny Watkins and Simon Latham showing that under the conditions of wartime, most people lean more utilitarian than they would otherwise. That, I think there's conditions where humans can live that it renders this deontological consideration a kind of luxury that, oh, I don't want to hurt anyone. That's great, but they're coming to hurt you. So what are you going to do? Just let them?
That's just fascinating, and I would love to unpack that at another time. Let's get back to, you were speaking to colleagues about doing some studies within the law enforcement community about social psychology, and then what led you specifically to child crimes investigators?
Like I said, my collaborators had already identified this group. They had this collaboration lined up. They know various police organizations and have been involved at various levels. I am more of a traditional academic. I sit here in my office, I have students, I teach classes, and I don't really know, or didn't at the start of this project, I didn't really know any police or organizations. This wasn't really on my radar. I was coming at this from a basic science perspective of someone interested in the psychological constructs involved, such as moral injury. And so my colleagues said, hey, we have all these police who really want to take the study, but we don't have anyone to analyze the data. And I was saying, I can analyze the data. Next thing you know, here we are.
Let me ask you, before we talk about the study and your findings, did you have any preconceived notions going into the study as to how you thought it would evolve and what the results would be? And if so, were they in alignment with what you actually found, or?
This isn't my area of focus. So I didn't have a lot of preconceived notions going in, but I assumed, based on the rest of the field and all the typical findings, the real problem would be PTSD. That seems like a fair assumption. Reading the rest of the field, people talk a lot about the experiences of PTSD, this post-traumatic stress disorder. And the idea is, if you have a difficult or stressful experience, like a combat experience or constantly exposed to other people's trauma, people in ambulances and so on, that eventually this kind of breaks you as a human, and that you have a sort of a personal trauma response that is hard to suppress. And that would be the big issue, that police officers viewing this material over and over, day in and day out, they're seeing kids get hurt, they're seeing brutal crimes being committed, and that it would be personally traumatizing. So PTSD would be the primary problem, and that would predict most of the negative outcomes. And that's what the state of the field was.
Interesting. All right, so let's talk about it. Let's talk about your study. Let's unpack exactly what you did and your results. I'm super curious.
So in 2022, we got together and we recruited almost 700 police officers from all over the UK. We had everybody, Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland in there. We had almost 700 people, police officers and police staff, civilians working for the police, and all of them had roles relevant to this exploitation of children. We had many people around for 10 years or more in their role. We had a wide variety of people from different backgrounds, relationship statuses, and so on. And we asked them a whole lot of questions about their work experience, their feelings, their depression, anxiety, PTSD being moral injury, and what kinds of services they're using to manage the problems of the job and how they feel about those. What I can do, I can take you on a tour of the results of the study.
Let's do that.
Talk bit by bit. The first thing that we did is we wanted to look at overall average rates of depression, anxiety, and PTSD and compare those to clinical benchmarks. So we had sort of official measures. For depression, we used a measure called the PHQ-9, the Patient Health Questionnaire 9. It's a very widely used measure of depression. And when we did this, what we found in this sample of almost 700 UK police officers is that you can slice people up into 5 chunks: minimal, mild, moderate, moderately severe, and severe risk of depression. And the last 3 categories together are people who likely qualify for clinical major depression. And in our sample, that was 27.7%. Over a quarter of the sample likely qualify for major depression, according to our findings. They score moderate, moderately severe, or severe on the measure.
And now you take those numbers and you compare them to, what demographic are you comparing that to?
So those are clinical benchmarks from published work that says if people score X, and it's based on large samples of clinically depressed people in the past in hospitals. But one other comparison you can do is you can say, okay, what percentage of this group met that benchmark? What about that group? So a few comparisons. We have a sample of 172,000 UK general population people. In that sample, 1.5% would qualify for major depression versus 27% in the current sample.
Wow.
In that sample, in the UK general population, if you look at people with a history of depression, 7% would qualify as likely major depression today. And if you look at people with a history of bipolar disorder, the largest single risk group in the whole sample, you're talking 12%. So,
which is half of what you found in this study. That is terrible.
Yeah.
It's sad.
Yeah.
Quite honestly. 27%. Wow.
So overall, this sample, very depressed.
Yes. And that doesn't surprise me. Honestly, that does not surprise me. What surprises me is the data that we're going to get to here pretty quickly. Right. That is very surprising. But anyway, I'm sorry. Continue, Paul. Thank you.
Okay, so next we look at anxiety. We measured this thing called the Generalized Anxiety Disorder 7, another widely used measure. And again, you can slice people up: minimal, mild, moderate, and severe. And if you do that, we find that 24.2% may qualify for generalized anxiety disorder. So another quarter of the sample here. And again, that's a clinical benchmark, but you can look at other groups and how did they score. So there's a 2020 paper looking at 40,000 UK police from Stevelig and colleagues. They found that the number among general UK police was 8.5%.
Almost three times as high of people in child crimes compared to regular police officers. Now, not the general public, police officers doing law enforcement roles. So that right there shows you the elevation of just doing this certain type of crime. That is sadly fascinating again.
And if you do want the general public, our numbers from 30,000 UK general residents, 2.2%. So 10 times higher.
So this is already, we're just at the beginning of this, and already we're showing that just this particular job type has a very big impact on depression and anxiety. Wow. That's fascinating.
So next up, we decided to look at PTSD, which again, we thought would be the most important factor, the big one that would explain most of the outcomes of people in this area. And we used a measure called the International Trauma Questionnaire, which again gives you clinical threshold and so on. And according to this measure, it would be 8.7% meet the threshold for clinical levels of PTSD or complex PTSD.
And then what's that compared to what other groups you have?
So we
to compare?
thought, 8%, that sounds bad, maybe. And then we started looking around the literature and we found that there's in a Canadian community sample, their finding was 7.8%, so almost the same. There's a UK representative community sample from 2018. They found 18% of people score in the clinical range for PTSD. And then if you look at clinical samples or veteran samples, you're talking 70% or higher. So surprisingly, PTSD did not seem elevated in this group.
Why do you think that is, Paul?
It's shocking. Yeah, it's a great
It is.
question. Why do you
It really
think
is.
that is?
So personally, thank you for throwing that back on me so you can have time to think about your answer. I think the reason that is because this job, it's like a rolling thing. You're in it for so long and you're constantly looking at it. Now, if I'm going to compare PTSD to something, say a war veteran, I would think that a particular incident, like the base got attacked one night, or a friend of mine was killed in front of me, or I accidentally shot somebody, or some incident, some horrible thing happened, but it wasn't every single day this horrible thing happened. It was, I was over there for 9 months and I had 3 incidents happen. 1, I lost a friend. 2, we got firebombed, and 3, some other incident. But in this crime type, or I should say in this field, it's every single day you are going through and you're saying, like you said, watching children being hurt, being brutalized. And it becomes just this big, for me anyway, it just become this big like fog of all this stuff rolled together in one. To me, PTSD is more of a particular thing. Now, I will admit readily that there are times when I think of an image or a video and there's certain material that stick in my head. Now, I've worked through these clinically and gotten to the point where they don't really cause me that anxiety and that feeling like I'm back there watching the video again. But I think that's the long answer too. I think because it's a rolling trauma. And one of the interesting things I will say is when we asked for mental health support with the Phoenix Police Department when I was still on, we had a person come to us who was an expert in critical incident stress debriefings. So he came in and he explained to us, he said, hey, what I do is I debrief people who have left the Oklahoma City bombing, for example, or 9/11. He debriefs all the first responders. So he talked to us, went around the room, asked what we were doing, and we told him all the things that we did and how we lived in this world and we swam in the waters all day long, constantly. And he left. He said, all right, let me regroup and come back and see what I can do for you. And when he came back, he said, I don't know what to do with you guys. He said, I don't know how to handle you because when I talk to somebody, the bombing's over. Oklahoma City bombing has completed. You're now back home. Now you're going to suffer this body you uncovered or something is going to cause you PTSD. But he said with you guys, every single day you're at the bombing site. You're every single day. So yeah, to me, super long answer, and I'll probably edit the crap out of this, but my answer is because it's just constantly happening. It's like this thing, the depression and the anxiety makes a lot of sense to me because you're just every day you're like, oh, this is just the worst, and it's poor this, but they all blends together after a while, the horrors. So I mean, my mind doesn't focus on one specific thing. It's just the horrors in general. So that would be my reason as to why it's not as high or it's the same as just regular community.
Yeah.
What about you?
So, consistent with that, I have a colleague, Roberta Sinclair in Canada, and she has some data of officers who retired. And she argues that PTSD rates are somewhat lower as people are in the field, but when they retire after a few years, they look back with normalcy and say, oh, wow, that was like more messed up than I realized.
Oh, that's good. That's interesting. That's very interesting because that's one of the discussions that I've been broaching with several individuals that I want to dig deeper into, and that is the effects of retirement from this kind of job
Mm,
as well. So that's fascinating. That makes a lot of sense too, because yeah, I like what you said, looking back on it with normalcy, because now you're not swimming in those waters
mhm,
anymore. You've stepped away. And
mhm,
I would imagine your brain is going to focus on the big things that you remember. That's
mhm.
fascinating. I love that.
Yeah.
Wow. That's interesting though, but big surprise. That's a huge surprise to me that it's equivalent with your first comparison group. Percentage wise, it's almost exactly the same as the general community, which is interesting. Now, I understand the higher rates of veterans seeking clinical help
Sure.
because yeah, of course. But wow, that just blows me away that PTSD is
Yeah.
not significant as a factor there.
Yeah,
Wow.
us as well. We're pretty surprised by that.
All right, what's next?
Okay, so the next analysis we did these, what we call a regression analysis, similar to a correlation for those familiar, where we essentially looked at if people tend to score high on one variable, do they tend to score high on another? And so by doing kind of a glorified version of that, we're able to say, what are the various factors that are best predicting people's anxiety, depression, PTSD, and moral injury? Right. So we did a whole lot of analyses. And what we started with were the demographic factors that we included in the study. So we had age, gender, whether people were officer versus staff. We had the length of time of their total career, as well as the length of time spent in this role. Were they in a relationship? Are they the parent of a young child or caregiver to an elderly person? Have they ever been in therapy, and how religious are they? In terms of more religious being whatever your denomination is, you're more involved, you care more. Most people were Anglican in this sample in the UK.
Yeah.
And what we found, to our surprise again, is that looking down this list of predictors, almost nothing is significant. For example, younger people, older people, doesn't matter. Men versus women doesn't matter. Similar outcomes. Officers versus staff, similar outcomes. Length of career or role, no effect on these outcomes.
That is so surprising.
Yeah.
And I remember in the first interview, you asked me, the one that I screwed up the recording on, you asked me before you gave the answer, which one you thought was like, were veterans that have been doing this more affected or were the youth? And my response was that, of course, the veterans that have been doing it for years and years are going to be affected more demographically. And you said that's not the case, which is fascinating to
Yeah.
me. Absolutely. The other one that really I thought would be a huge predictor, and I've had people talk about this, is how things changed when they became the parent of a child.
Mhm.
And it doesn't seem like that's statistically significant either. Absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, both of those pretty surprising, and we originally expected both of those to matter.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure.
Instead, we did get a couple little effects. One effect we got is that people who reported that they had ever or currently were in therapy reported worse outcomes. We usually interpret
Which is
that.
counterintuitive to what you would hope was
Well,
happening, right?
if we were comparing, at time one, people who do and don't get therapy and they're equally distressed, we would expect the group in therapy to do better as time went on, but that's not the data we had. We have some people who are very distressed went to therapy, and other people less distressed didn't. Right? So we have,
Wow.
we don't have evidence that therapy is ineffective. We interpret this as people who are more upset tended to seek out therapy.
Wow. And then the religious piece.
Yes, for religiosity, yes. So people who are more religious tended to score actually worse. They had worse outcomes on at least a couple measures here. And that's generally incompatible with the rest of the literature. If you look at generally religious people in regular life, they tend to be happier, they live longer, they swear less. There's all sorts of finding. But here, religiosity is actually associated with worse outcomes. So it's quite rare, and it might reflect some unique features of this job. So I don't know if you had thoughts about that.
Yeah, I've worked with people that are religious. I've worked with people that are not religious, and I wouldn't have guessed that had any significance. Honestly, I wouldn't think, because depending on how they're looking at their religion, and I think you
Mm,
go into that as well. You talk about the negative
Ooh.
response and then the positive response to religiosity. So that I would have guessed that maybe religious people would be a little more, because this is counter to what they believe the world is and how it works. So
Mm.
that, I guess that makes some sense to me. Compared to being a parent, I would have thought it would have, like, religiosity would be insignificant when it comes to, hey, because I worked a job before I had a daughter, and then I worked a job while I had a daughter and after I had a daughter. So that to me seems like I'm just completely blown away by these results. It's insane to me.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so demographic factors were not generally very important. And so we turned next to our sets of theoretical predictors. And the first thing we tried to do was look at factors on the job that are predicting outcomes. We thought of them as risk factors and protective factors. We thought at first we looked at how much exposure do people have to this child exploitation material and how much contact do they have with victims and perpetrators. And then also, how successful and supported do they feel in their job? We developed a whole series of measures of these things. And we originally had slightly different ideas of how they would all line up with one another, but we ran this analysis called the factor analysis, and they clustered into 3 chunks. So these were the 3 chunks that we looked at. Okay, how are these predicting outcomes? And I guess this was another area where we did have pretty strong predictions going in. We thought it would be exposure to the material that would be particularly toxic.
Agreed. I would agree with that.
But the way a lot of people talk about it is what happens in this job is you go in a fresh-faced person, you get exposed to too much material, it's traumatizing, and then you develop PTSD and leave.
Yeah, that's the story. That's the story. I can't take it anymore. Or I've looked at the last possible image. I'm overexposed.
Mm-hmm.
I can't do this anymore. And I've interviewed people. That's their exact story.
Yeah,
But of course,
can
you
occur.
hear that story and you stop there and you take it for face value and you say, "Oh, that makes complete sense to me." But then you don't talk about the other risk factor groups that you were talking about, like
Mhm.
contact with the
Mhm.
victims and perpetrators, and then whether or not you're feeling successful and supported. So that makes complete sense to me. That story is a believable story
Yeah,
for sure.
sure. But it doesn't line up very well with the data.
That
Yeah.
blew me away when I found that out. It absolutely blew me away. But when you think about it, it makes sense. If you really dig down into it, it absolutely makes sense. But anyway, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Continue.
Okay.
Thank you.
What we found is that when people reported more exposure to this CSAM material, this child exploitation material, they reported slightly elevated moral injury, but they did not report more depression, anxiety, PTSD, or well-being. It didn't affect them. It wasn't significant.
My head just shook
Yeah.
when you said that. My head just shook.
Yeah.
No, but my brain is looking at it right now. It's thinking, wow.
I mean, that's what the numbers show. This is what, we asked 600, 700 people, like, how much exposure do you have and how are you feeling? And
The numbers don't lie.
numbers don't
Wow,
lie.
that's fascinating.
Likewise,
Anyway, apologies.
contact with victims and perpetrators, okay, didn't predict moral injury. It did predict modestly higher depression, anxiety, PTSD, not well-being. So they,
I think. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
no,
No, I was going to say, I think if I'm going to throw out my opinion on there, my uneducated, half-baked opinion, I believe that is because when I'm thinking about that, I think looking at the material is one thing. There's a disconnect. It's because you're looking at an image. It's a picture on a computer screen. This is a bad analogy, but like when you're looking at someone's vacation photo, they take a picture of this beautiful island and it looks, that's a great picture, but it's a picture. It does not capture what they felt when they were actually standing there taking that photograph. And now when you are actually contacting with the perpetrators and they're talking about what they did with the material, or they're talking about what they did to that child, now there's no disconnect. You are face to face with it, and again, like I said, you're swimming in the water. So this is now reality to you. It's not something that you can just say, that was a photo, that was a video, it was taken years ago, we don't even know who that is. I think that's caused because of the fact that it's now reality and there's no escaping it.
Sure.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
That's my opinion. Do you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, that makes sense to me that it's definitely more personal, more emotionally evocative to have
That's
actual contact with victims or perpetrators, family of victims. And you're seeing more personally the impact, or you're thinking personally about this person could have been me and they're going to jail now. And it's a lot. Yeah, it's different than seeing someone's vacation photos or just something that is less concrete. Sure.
that's interesting.
The thing is, though, okay, so this exposure to the material and contact with victims and perpetrators, so they did predict worse outcomes, but quite modestly. And the effect sizes here were a lot smaller than the third category, which predicted far better this job success and support factor. So these were people who said things like, I feel my work is valuable and meaningful. I'm encouraged to seek mental support from my supervisor or team. I feel supported by my supervisor or team, as well as my partner, friends, or family. And I feel my voice is heard and I have input into decisions that affect me. Those people reported substantially lower moral injury, depression, anxiety, PTSD, and substantially higher well-being across the board, double or triple the impact of the other factors.
Just being supported, feeling supported,
Yeah.
basically, in a general sense.
Yep.
Wow. By not just the people you work with, but your family, your partners. Wow.
Yeah.
So more than anything, by a significant degree, it is the feeling of being supported or not supported that really sways the emotional, moral injury, depression, anxiety. Wow.
Yeah.
That is, it's not surprising, right? It's like that. I don't know. It's just, yeah, it doesn't surprise. It totally surprises me that the exposure to the material is almost insignificant when it comes to that. That's one of the things when I look back on it and I think about it and I talk to people that have been in the job, and I've been in a situation where I've had both supervisor types. I've had the ones that are leaning in, what can I do to help? And the others that are like, nope, that's your job. I don't want to have anything to do with that. And boy, I didn't realize that could eat away at you at such a higher factor, emotional factor than the actual material. If I unpack that a little bit, I would imagine that, so I'm looking at all this horrifying material and all these children doing all this terrible stuff. And if I have a boss that's supportive, hey, what can I do? What can I help? That's completely different than I'm looking at all this horrible material and they don't care. Nobody cares.
Yeah.
Why am I doing this? Why am I hurting myself? Why am I watching these children get brutalized when nobody that's in charge even cares what I'm doing or listens to me when it comes to what my thoughts are and how I think we should handle these investigations? Absolutely blows me away. But again, when I think about it logically, it's not surprising. It really isn't. I use the analogy of a child whose parents don't give a crap about them and aren't a part of their life and don't give them a voice. Those are the children that rebel. Those are the children that do poorly in school. Socially, they don't do well when they don't have that support system. And that's one of the things we talk about is the importance of a support system in doing this job.
Oh, yeah. Humans are social creatures, and we can actually manage a lot if we have backup.
I love that. Yeah, and that's great because that's a term that's used in law enforcement daily, that we always want backup. And when you're a patrol officer, you go to an egregious situation, they send backup. If you're sitting at your desk doing this job and your boss doesn't give a crap, they're not going to send backup.
Yeah. And this helps us understand things like, why is career or role length not predicting? And
why?
The story that you've heard can be true for some people. If they're not getting support, then yeah, the stresses eventually will build up and they'll have to exit. But there's another group of people who are getting the support they need and they're able to just stay in the job without building up that they don't blow their top at some point.
I wonder what would cause somebody to be okay and then, or cause someone to not blow their top. You think They're all intermingled, right? They're all intertwined. So if you're working under a supervisor or a department that is shut up, do the work, I don't want to hear about it, that is the person that's going to eventually blow their top, as you said. Whereas someone else who's feeling more supported, that their department cares, that they would have a good end of their career.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And mathematically, people who tended to agree, so the items are, a little bit diverse, right? But people who tended to say, my work is valuable and meaningful, I'm supported by my supervisor or team, tended to agree with the rest of the questions as well. One cluster of people who agree with all of them, and another cluster who disagree with all of them. There's very few people who only agree with some, right? When you talk about work is valuable, meaningful, supported by my supervisor, supported by my partner, my voice is heard. You're either in the good zone or you're not with these items.
Yeah. Wow. It's not wishy-washy. It's either one or the other.
Yeah. So next what we did, so we looked at this construct of moral injury a little further. And so again, moral injury, this is where I got excited. The moral injury is this idea of damage to the self-concept because you did bad things, you witnessed bad things, or you felt that bad things happened beyond your control. So you were betrayed by the leadership, by the colleagues. It was developed originally for soldiers coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq. So you can imagine bad things went down in Iraq and now I'm in America trying to deal with this and I feel morally injured as a result of my experiences there. And so there's various ways to measure this, but we used a pretty common measure, the moral injury events scale, and it tries to break this down into 3 chunks as well. So one is transgression self, so I did bad things. Then there's transgression other, I saw other people do bad things. And then betrayal, I felt betrayed by leaders and colleagues that I once trusted. And again, we looked at, of these predictors, which are doing the best job at predicting outcomes, right? And what was your prediction? Do you recall?
I believe that I thought the transgression other was going to be the most significant. I didn't think transgression self because I don't think a lot of people in this field are going to really have too much of that. They've done something horribly wrong because we're doing good. We're trying to do good. I can see that in a war effort where you had to shoot somebody that maybe you did something that hurt another person. But in this field, I don't see too much of that actually going on. Like doing something bad when you're just trying to protect children. But I can totally see the transgression other for sure. Not what your results showed.
So my understanding is that at least some of the work that can occur here involves people sometimes going undercover and misrepresenting themselves, the perpetrators, pretending to be something they're not. From a deontological perspective, all of that is technically, ethically wrong, even if from a utilitarian perspective, it's going to make the world better. I think there's room for some people to feel like their hands are not clean.
Yeah, and it's when you say that, that's interesting because I did interview a gentleman and I've talked to other people who do go online undercover, and he talked about how horrible it was to have to pretend to be this, to switch from being a husband to now I'm trying to get people to have sex with my grandchildren.
Yeah.
So yes, that falls under the transgression self, which I didn't even think of. But still, I think my answer would have been the same had I would say transgression other.
Reasonable. We as well, transgression other will be the big one, wrapped up with this idea of exposure to the material. The more bad things people do, probably the worse you would feel. But that is not what we should call. Others
not even close.
Predict anything.
Wow, which is crazy. And I see that transgression self, higher PTSD, lower well-being, for sure, when just like you said, because you have to put your mind, you have to go there in your mind. If you're going to be pretending to be a pedophile that either wants children or then you have to go there in your mind. In order to be successful, you have to go there. So that makes sense for sure.
That said, transgression self, it does, predict slightly higher PTSD, slightly lower well-being, not depression, anxiety, but the effects are relatively small. It's pretty modest. And they pale in comparison to this third factor, betrayal. People who said, I felt betrayed by colleagues that I trusted or like the leadership. Those people reported substantially higher depression, anxiety, PTSD, and much lower well-being. Again, double or triple the size of the other effect.
Again, that gets back to support, right? That gets back to backup. Nobody sent backup.
Nobody sent backup, so I'm all alone. Leadership doesn't care. They threw me in this den of vipers and they just closed the door and abandoned me. And yeah, people
And
feel that. Or
God, it's funny you say the den of vipers, because that's one of the things we talk about. And this is a repeated theme. They put you in a room, and I joked about this. They put us in a windowless room inside a windowless building that only we had access to, key card. No one could get into the room unless they had specific permission. And the joke that I made is they throw a tarp over you. They basically, because they're ashamed of the work that you're doing. We were told by our command staff to not do press releases anymore because we didn't want people to think that Arizona was the pedophile capital of the world. I had that discussion with a gentleman that I just released his interview today, and he said the same thing. He said, why? That's the exact opposite of what you should be doing. You should be saying, hey, we caught this one, we caught this one, we caught this one, we caught this one, to show how successful and how hardworking and how much the people doing the job care.
right.
But the department did the exact opposite. Wow.
Interesting. It's actually one of the suggestions I give later on, is like specific examples of victory.
Yes.
Yeah, people need that. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And that's one thing we talk about too, is showing appreciation and gratitude for people doing the job, for sure. Wow. That completely, where's the help? Where's
back?
And Paul, I've had circumstances where I've run into people, like literally run into old friends at the main station, and they're like, hey, Eric, how come every time I see you after I'm done, I feel like I want to take a shower?
Yeah.
That's one of those, that kind of, that chips away at you. That really does. This is my colleague, and he doesn't, and I'm a joke. Yeah. I'm half a joke to this person. All this incredible work I'm doing, and I'm half a joke.
Yeah.
Like, man, I can feel that for sure.
Yeah.
Wow. That's interesting. And then I see here that it says it's different. Your results are different from the military samples.
Right.
When transgression other did predict more outcomes.
Yep.
Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I think it's like you said. I think these military samples are mainly Afghanistan and Iraq veterans, and they're reporting personal encounters with villains or people. They're witnessing people terrorize civilian populations. They're seeing the outcomes firsthand. It's personally affecting them, as opposed to this sort of the distance of an image taken of a person far away. It's harder to emotionally resonate, I suspect.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
Very interesting. This is fascinating stuff, Paul.
Yeah. So next we looked at, we said, let's measure some coping strategies that people might be using and try and figure out what are going to be more useful or less useful strategies. And so we drew upon this literature. There's some work by these colleagues, Garnevsky and Cry, and they have these large measures of cognitive and emotional regulation. They come up with different strategies like self-blame, acceptance, rumination, refocusing, planning, positive reappraisal, catastrophizing, other blame. And there's too many outcomes to go into each one, but I can summarize that overall, people with better outcomes were engaging in positive reappraisal, positive refocusing, and planning. So they're saying, it's not so bad, I still care about other things, and here's what I'm going to do next. They're looking forward. They're looking forward to things in their life. They're looking forward to the future, the weekend, their family, other things. They're maintaining this perspective and this sense of balance between their work and the rest of their life. But people have worse outcomes when they engage in a lot of self-blame, rumination, putting into perspective, catastrophizing, and other blame. So they're saying, I'm the worst. I can't stop thinking about it. It's very bad compared to other things. This is the worst, and you're the worst. They're stuck in a world where it's everything. It's taken over their life. They can't care about other things. It seems to be what these measures would suggest. I talked to the colleagues at Interpol, and I basically said, watch out for this, right? Watch out for this pattern of thinking. Some people are like, okay, it's Friday. Guess what? On the weekend, I'm going to go visit my kids and we're going to do the thing. And then other people are just like stuck in the dreary world where they're suspicious of everyone. They can't stop ruminating. They can't stop, worrying. They can't stop.
And
Sure.
that's prolific, absolutely prolific in the world. It was difficult for me, and we actually talk about some of the coping strategies of creating rituals. So when you come home, you remove I would remove all the clothing that I wore that day, and I would
Mhm.
switch into my I'm not doing this work anymore outfit, and
Mhm.
that would help. Or coming up with a ritual where you come home and when you tell your family, I have X amount of time, give me this time to be alone, and then once I'm once I do that, then I can switch. But it is not easy. It is very difficult to do that, especially when you have a caseload
Mhm.
that continues that you'll never ever get to. You'll never ever be able to get to all the people. So
Mhm.
when you get home, you're still ruminating on those cases and things that are going on, and you're seeing the kids, your family's playing with other children, and now you're thinking about the children that you need to try to get to. So yeah, that's insane to me. Completely makes sense for
Mhm.
sure. So, wow. So what's the fix? What's the I guess that's not your that's not your area of
Yeah, no,
expertise, but
we do have some suggestions. We'll get to
yeah.
that, I think, in just
Okay, yeah,
a
yeah.
bit. It's tempting. We have a
Yeah,
few
it
really
sure
fine.
is.
Let me just tell you a couple of the things that we looked at. We mentioned religiosity, and you mentioned this idea of religious coping. So we said,
Mhm.
okay, maybe there's different religious people have a different way of coping with this than less religious. And so there's this measure out there of using religion to cope, measure of religious coping. And it divides things up into positive coping. So I focus on my religion to stop worrying about my problems, and what they call negative coping. So this idea that because I'm religious and I experience this negative event, it's making me question my faith. I'm questioning God's love for me, that kind of thing. And similar to the military samples, we found no effect of positive religious coping on any outcome measure. It doesn't seem to be that people who are religious are drawing on their faith for strength to face this problem. Instead, negative coping is predicting worse outcomes across the boards. People who are more religious are saying, I don't know, I go to church on Sunday, and then on Monday I go to work and I see what's happening to these kids, and did they deserve it? On Sunday they said God loves everyone, and Monday it's apparently not those kids.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
See, that's and I lost my religion because of this work for sure. If I was ever questioning anything, this tipped the scales for me for sure because not that I questions God's love for me, I questioned God's what's the word I'm looking for? I questioned his ability to even do anything.
mhm.
Is he impotent? Is he impotent? Either so my conclusion was he's either evil or impotent, one of the two. If he exists, he's either doing nothing about it or he doesn't care that it's
Mhm.
happening. So yeah, I can totally see that for sure.
Yeah,
For sure, the
it
negative
may be
impact.
a fairly common experience that people have. We're now running a similar study on military chaplains who, experience war zones. And there's definitely a prediction that many of them will report losing their faith or at least questioning their faith in light of those experiences.
Wow. Yeah, that's fascinating as well. That's going to be really good.
Another thing we did, we started asking people about resources, these well-being resources. We had a fairly detailed list of different options or resources available to people, and we asked, okay, so how many people reported, yeah, we have access to this? People rated how much they use it, how helpful is it, and what are some barriers, right? And what we found is that on average, out of our almost 700 people, 550 reported that they had access to an occupational health therapist, and over 400 said they have access to self-referred counseling, and 300 said a peer support program, and a number of people mentioned other possible support resources. And we also asked how helpful these various things were on a scale from 1 to 7, right? Where 1 is very unhelpful and 7 is very helpful. And the average is around the midpoint, around 4 out of 7. It's not bad. Some people thought they were a little more helpful and others a little less. But on average, people said these are moderately helpful resources. Then we said, okay, how often do you use these resources on a scale from 1 to 7, where 1 is never, or almost never, and the average here was just above a 1. 2 was like not quite never. And yeah, so people said, I never or almost never use any resource at all, despite a majority saying they have access to some of them, and most people rating them at least moderately used.
Wow. That's not surprising in the slightest. And I have probably some reasons why, but I'm sure you have some.
You're someone who may have been able to use some at some point. So why?
Yes, and I did. I actually did take advantage of, but it was one of those things where, yes, there's access to an occupational health therapist or self-referred counseling, but that's for everybody. And it's equal across the department. Whether you're working in traffic, you're an administrator, it didn't matter. You get X amount of visits a year, 6 a year paid for, and you can double that to 12. But everybody gets that. There was nothing above and beyond what there was. Most people, this does not surprise me in the slightest, Paul, that most people said never, I don't use any of that stuff. And I would say I would predict that the number one reason is fear of confidentiality because of the culture, because you're supposed to be strong. It's a sign of weakness. It's a sign of weakness if you do that. So I would think that I don't want anybody to find out that I'm weak. I don't want anyone to think that I'm broken. I don't want to think that I'm broken, because if I face it now, Paul, if I turn around and say I need help, and I say it to myself, then I have to face the fact that I feel, because of the culture and the stigma, that I personally feel like I'm now broken. So that would scare me to do that.
Oh yeah,
for sure.
I get it. And word gets around. So we asked people questions like, how much do you agree with these various barriers to seeking support? And a lot of people agreed that they want to seem capable. There's pressure to seem strong. Weakness is not allowed in this culture. And it seems like everyone else can cope. They were worried about undermining their job prospects, and they don't trust the confidentiality. If they start going to therapy, their advisor or supervisor is going to find out, and it might come back to bite them when they go for promotion.
This is not surprising. It all makes sense. All makes sense. I was recently teaching a mental health awareness class in Salt Lake City, and at the break, one of the guys came up to me and he said, "Hey, we're trying to implement this wellness program with everybody, but one person came forward and did something, and the person that they told other people, and it got out immediately." And he said, "How do you fix that?" I told him, I said, "You can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. Like, you have to start over again, and there has to be this layer of confidentiality." Now, the flip side of that is I've also spoken to agencies and units where it was in so much confidence that even the other people doing the same job, even the other peer support people in the group, had no idea that anything had ever happened. But yeah, every single one of these ticks in my mind. I feel pressured to seem strong, and that's because of the workplace culture. And obviously, I don't want to be this person that's like, I can't do this, because again, weakness. I love that everyone else can cope. Hey, they're all doing fine,
right? So
I should be doing just as good as them.
Yeah.
And then worrying that it would undermine any of your future job prospects, for sure. That makes sense. But the one that fascinates me is I'm not convinced seeking support will help and might even cause harm. I'm still blown away by the fact that over half, and then almost 90%-ish, either have peer support, self-referred counseling, or occupational health therapists available, and almost nobody uses them.
Yeah.
One of the things we always thought was, hey, nobody has access to these people. No one's got access. They don't have a support system set up. But according to your numbers, there are support systems, and they're just not using them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
I've talked to a lot of people now about these barriers and why they occur, and maybe some ways to overcome them. A lot of talk about this idea of the police culture. Right? It's a very sort of a macho culture where feelings are not valued or might be seen as weakness, that you want to seem powerful and strong in front of your colleagues, and admitting that this stuff is getting to you. You're seeing images of kids on the internet and something's gotten to you. That's the opposite of being powerful and strong. And so some people have suggested some pragmatic ways to try and tackle this. And one thing is, it can start with leadership. So you can have senior people in this area talk about times they felt upset or distressed, and maybe some steps they took when they did that, which communicates to everyone that's normal, it happens, and that person still got promoted. So takes away a lot of the stigma.
And it adds the humanity to it. Listen, we're not all perfect. I am a human being. I've suffered the same things. That's brilliant. That is absolutely brilliant to have the senior folks be vulnerable
Yeah.
is basically what you're saying. Showing vulnerability, but still having a positive career.
Yeah.
You're senior management now.
Right.
You still made it through all the stuff. You're still okay.
Still okay. Yeah. That's a big one. Another one that, like you were saying, with therapy sessions and the availability of it, these are often very generalized people. These are not specialists. They don't know this area. They don't know the specific experiences people have. So there's a lot of talk of more informal sort of peer support, mentoring type stuff, one-on-one coffee sessions, maybe with a senior colleague and a junior colleague in this area. Like ongoing, like maybe once a month or whatever, just a check-in for half an hour. How's it going?
That's one of the things we talk about is having regular meetings, having regular, just like you said, check-ins. Cops have meetings all the time. I don't remember a week that I went in my job. I don't think that there wasn't some meeting that I had to go to, whether it had to do with something completely unrelated or not. Why not take that time to check in emotionally as well? That's brilliant, man. I love it.
And another one is and we already touched on this idea of giving people some victories to rally around, like getting people a clearer sense of, after they have handled the material in a particular case, what ended up happening there to the kids involved or the perpetrators. Are things better now because of the work that they did?
Man, feeling like you're not making a difference, feeling like, and not ever getting a thank you. Paul, I have a stack of cards. It's not a very big stack. It's probably about a centimeter high of cards that where people have thanked me. People in doing an investigation have thanked me, and I have those. I had them pinned up on my cubicle. People want to feel appreciated, and the one thing that we also teach is how good it feels to show appreciation. That also helps with the mental well-being, because you are giving thanks to somebody who's doing something wonderful, and there's no downside.
Yeah.
What is the downside to doing that? Somebody please tell me the downside to talking about feelings, to having a culture that values you as a human being and your emotional health and well-being first. What's the downside to any of this? I don't understand. The only downside that I can think of is it flies in the face of, we're tough. We should be able to handle anything. You can't pretend that there's no humanity. You can't pretend that the stressors aren't the stressors. You just can't. But I love this list of resources you have, for sure. And this goes completely in alignment with all the things that make sense and all the things that I've learned and I've passed on to other people as well.
Right.
Just
restore the humanity to it and enable the human connection. And that.
Thank you. Yes, thank you for saying that from a scientific standpoint, because that is 100% where I'm coming from, an uneducated emotional standpoint. Like that is, I love that it intersects that way. But yes, that's the one thing I've been saying is, and we've talked about that, is you have to start with your people are human beings first and foremost. It's not an empty uniform. It's a human being with feelings and fears and desires and hopes and dreams and grief and stress and anxiety, depression, all these things. It's so very important. The study in my mind went in a different direction than I thought. But at the end of the day, the resources and the things that we need to help fix this problem are the same. Whether it was the material that screwed you up, or it was not being supported by or whatever it was, the resources, they wouldn't be any different, would they? If CSAM was the number one thing that caused this, what would change the resources? I don't think anything.
No, that's similar, really, I think. I guess the one key difference is that, like, these data suggest that the social factors are more powerful than people realized. I understand there's been a lot of interventions about things like the images should be black and white instead of color so that they're less impactful on the average viewer, and people should have limited viewing times. There's been a lot of policies around the material itself and regulating that. But what seems to go under the radar is how powerful and important, like, friends and colleagues and the humanizing element is. If we spend just a small amount on that, I think it should reap large dividends.
That is absolutely the case. Because again, what's the downside too? There's no downside to any of this. But yes, there are features and tools that have things built into them. So there's a setting in a lot of the softwares right now where you can turn it into black and white. You can blur the imagery, you can do stuff like that. But at the end of the day, that's statistically insignificant. It's not wrong to do that. And it's absolutely, if that helps, then implement those measures.
Sure.
But implement the measures that are scientifically shown based on the study and what people are asking for. That's where we need to focus our efforts, is the humanity in all of this.
Yeah. Yeah.
I want to jump back to one thing that I saw in your study here. And you had a couple of quotes there under the barriers to seeking support. The first one was senior management doesn't know what's going on. But this other bullet point you have here, it says, because the perpetrators come from all walks of life, many with highly responsible positions and jobs, I find it difficult to trust and I feel suspicious of the people I come into contact with, especially outside of work. Completely, that rings very true to me as well, because I've arrested people from every single socioeconomic level you can imagine. From people who are multimillionaires to homeless people. I've arrested women. It's insane. I've arrested young people, old people. Like, it's anybody and it's everybody. That's what I tell people. It's anybody and everybody. So how do you combat that? How do you combat that's a question that how do you combat having that feeling? And I've heard that from other people as well, that you look at like David, the first person that I interviewed for this, he said he goes to a school event and he sees 100 kids and 10 of them are victims.
Yeah.
10 of these kids are victims. And then he starts thinking about who's the parents, which are the ones that I want to take behind the dumpster and beat up. So that's a tricky one there.
Yeah.
That's a tricky one. But I just love the fact that basically organizational culture is the key, is what you're saying here.
Yeah, I think it's just culture is the key.
And that just goes completely in alignment with exactly what I'm hoping for out of this. I came to it from a different direction. I love that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. So what other conclusions did you come up with from your study?
Yeah, people want a culture that prioritizes mental health. They want more social activities with their colleagues, and they want more self-referral to funded counseling that is outside the scope of their supervisor.
Yes.
I understand that part of the problem is if in order to get counseling, you have to basically get it approved and stamped by your immediate supervisor, which, that's going in your review file for when you're up for promotion. And people want the ability to get support without it tanking their career.
And that is, yes, absolutely. And that kind of goes in alignment with I'm afraid it's going to get out there and it's not going to be confidential because now it's in my jacket, it's in my file, or this sergeant is going to laugh at me when I leave and then he's going to laugh when I leave the office, and then he's going to go have lunch with a buddy and tell this buddy how he's got this screwed up person on their job.
Yeah.
Which has happened.
Yeah.
And has happened repeatedly and repeatedly. It's not an irrational fear to think that there's not going to be confidence behind this. That is based on history of that exact thing happening. I remember being a young person. I remember being a young officer and hearing stories of people that did something that would be considered weakness, and I laughed and snickered at them just as well.
Sure.
I've since grown to a different place in my life after seeing and hearing all the things that have been going on. I'm very fortunate to have grown that way. This goes in alignment with everything that we teach, certainly with the SHIFT program, but I love that more social interaction with the people that they're working with.
Yeah.
Love that.
Yeah. So people want that human connection and to feel not alone.
You just used the exact same words from Beth Medina. That was my first clinician interview on my podcast. She said the exact same thing. It's about the human connection. And you have absolutely validated that with your study. You've come up with some incredibly eye-opening results, but at the end of the day, it comes back to that human connection.
Yeah.
And I love it. And I am going to name this episode, it's going to be called Send Backup.
Yeah, I like that. Oh, that's good.
Yeah, that's good stuff.
Yeah.
Paul, this has absolutely been incredible. Thank you so much for doing this study, and thank you for your time. And I would like to see this study duplicated in the United States. And I think we talked about that in our original interview. I'm going to do my best to see if I can get you in front of the group of ICAC commanders, because like you said, having the command staff, having senior management, talking with people regularly, is all about that, all about connecting human, and they have regular meetings, group discussions, one-on-ones. He really keeps it human, and that is the key. And you have unlocked that effort with this study. There's no denying it at this point. There really isn't. I just would love to see this done on a broader scale to see if there's any differences between the culture here in the United States and the culture in the UK.
Cool.
But it's people like you, Paul, that are putting in these efforts to expose what's happening, the true results, and then to come up with these amazing conclusions and resources and things that you think could help mitigate this. It's just fascinating, and it is so very much appreciated. I hope you know how much this study is going to help people realize, because it's not just a couple of cops running their mouth. This is data. This is science. This is data, and that's what we have to go with. And I thank you from the bottom of my heart for this work that you've done and that you continue to do. And I really hope we can get you to continue this study in the United States. I'm going to do everything I can in my limited power to have you duplicate that here in the United States. At the very least, talk to the commanders, the senior management about what your study concludes. So I really want to get in front of the ICAC commanders at the very least.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So I'm really going to try to get this going, because I would love to see a larger scale. I don't think the numbers are going to be too much different, but I would love to see a larger scale done in the U.S. And I think you said this before too, like people in the U.S. want United States data or something like that. You said something that, they want to hear it from their own people.
Sure.
But you know what? We're all the same doing this job. People doing this job, they're all swimming in the same horrible waters that people in other countries are too. But anyway, thank you so much. Any final thoughts, Paul, on this study or what we have to do moving forward?
Just thank you. Thanks for having me, and thanks for pursuing this topic. It's clearly a passion project for you, and that's invigorating.
Good, because don't think that your work is going unnoticed. Please, this is absolutely groundbreaking stuff, and I'm going to continue to talk to other researchers in this field to get more and more of a scientific background, actual scientific studies to validate or show that maybe it's not the material like that. That just blows me away, completely blows me away. But I'm a believer in science, and I'm a believer in people like you that are out there and they're really digging into things that really matter. So Paul, thank you again very much, and I look forward to having more conversations with you about this in the future.
Great. Thanks, Eric. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to this incredibly mind-blowing episode of Harmless the Podcast, in which I was very much educated as far as what really is causing the mental health issues with investigators, not to negate by any stretch of the imagination the effects of looking at incredibly large amounts of child sexual exploitation material, or CSAM. But it's incredible what his study has unraveled, and I look forward to a time where he can conduct this study in a broader audience, perhaps in the United States. So if you are listening to this podcast and you know of anybody who could help assist Dr. Paul Conway in getting his study to the United States, please do not hesitate to contact me at harmlessthepodcast@gmail.com. And as always, if you like this podcast and you like the material you're listening to, please consider subscribing and pass this on to 2 people that you know and care about. And if there's someone that needs to hear this podcast anonymously, do not hesitate to email me at harmlessthepodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for listening.